Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I also serve as the director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race and Rights, which hosts the Race and Rights Podcast. The Center for Security, Race and Rights engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. Today's episode is entitled The Two Faces of American Freedom, featuring Professor Aziz Rana, the J. Donald Momen University Professor of Law and Government at Boston College of Law. Professor Rana offers an insightful critical analysis of the American experience within the global history of colonialism. Specifically, he examines the intertwined relationship and U.S. constitutional practice between internal accounts of freedom and external projects of power and expansion. Professor Rana reinterprets American political traditions from the colonial period to modern times by placing race, immigration, and national security in the context of shifting notions of empire and citizenship. Let's hear what our guest has to say about a topic at the center of debates about American exceptionalism.
So for my presentation, what I thought I would do is I'd use my first book, The Two Faces of American Freedom, as a jumping off point for talking about some of really the profound tensions and contradictions that have marked contemporary American life. So over this last decade, we've seen the rise of really profound racial justice movements and protests. And in many ways, these movement politics have been a product, obviously, of concerns with the emergence of Donald Trump and the kind of racism and xenophobia that his politics represents, but also with the limitations of the Obama presidency, where on the one hand, you can have somebody that's African-American become president and indeed see elite Black and brown access to institutions of power. And so it feels in many ways like the country is pretty profoundly shifted and changed over the last half century. Yet at the same time, these last years have also witnessed the intensification of concerns around mass incarceration and policing, the growing intensification as well of racial wealth disparities that have reached numbers equivalent to the mid-20th century. And all of this has created a climate in which increasingly the conversation around race, for instance, has focused on questions of systemic racism or institutional racism. And in a way, that's a language to articulate the sense that while segregation is no longer officially the law of the land, so that the laws have changed, and we live in a context that is much more culturally tolerant of racial and other forms of diversity, nonetheless, there are underlying structures of inequality and hierarchy that shape who has wealth, who has power in the U.S. that seem to persist, if not intensify in various directions. And struggling with that tension in a way between the idea that the U.S. is post-racial and yet at the same time seems to be operating under the new Jim Crow has been a central theme of my own writing and scholarship. And it's a central theme of my first book. So what I'd like to do, I'll give a little bit of a roadmap of how I'm going to spend the rest of my 20 minutes, is first just kind of articulate the difference between the common narratives about American development and identity and the argument that I make in my book about identity that's organized around the idea of the U.S. as an experiment in what I call settler empire. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what generated the American Revolution and how the politics of revolution connected to ideas of both sovereignty and membership in early 20th century. Then I'm going to talk about how political identity and institutions shifted in the 20th century such that we don't even really think of the U.S. as an experiment in settlerism, and then end with some reflections really for the present that tie back to how I began the conversation. All right, so what's the most common way that people, habitually describe the American experience? So most commonly, let's say if you grew up in the US in the late 20th or the early 21st century, the way that people talked about the country was as a country that had been free and equal from the founding, but it was exceptional for the extent to which it was organized on principles of liberal equality that you can see going all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. At the same time, there's a sense that, well, yes, just like many societies, there were archaic and prejudicial practices that were part of this history. So that there's a history of slavery, there's a history of native expropriation. But these practices are really holdovers from an earlier time and don't go to the core of the American project. And indeed, American history is really about overcoming these archaic practices. So you have the Civil War and the abolition of slavery. You have the civil rights movement and the overcoming of Jim Crow. You have a variety of other significant social movements around the women's movement, or more recently LGBTQ rights, that speak to the steady transformation of identity in ways consistent with basic underlying principles. And that, if anything, the best way to think of the US is as a fundamentally liberal, if incompletely liberal society that's on a path to its own ultimate fulfillment and redemption. The argument I make in the book is that this approach obscures really as much as it reveals about national identity. And in many ways, I think the politics of the last decade has exposed some of the underlying tensions and problems within the classic way of thinking about the national project. I argue instead that the best way to actually make sense of American politics is to appreciate the extent to which it's an experiment in settlerism, not unlike a variety of other settler projects that were initially European, but in other parts of the non-European world. So the English in South Africa, the French in Algeria, and like these other settler projects in the US too, there was a basic legal and political divide between the rights and responsibilities given to those that were colonists, initial colonists and their descendants, as opposed to native peoples and those that found themselves subject to the power of the settler project. And in the US, this essential legal divide that marks a variety of different kinds of settler projects globally had four really profound characteristics that I just want to articulate in a little bit of depth. The first is that English colonists in the 17th century, and then colonists moving forward, brought from Europe, and especially from England, a really rich and radical tradition of Republican freedom. And the idea behind this tradition was that to be genuinely free, you had to enjoy something like self-rule over all of the institutional sites of collective life, over the spiritual domain, the economic domain, the political domain, through actual participation and engagement. At the heart of this idea of Republican freedom was a vision of land ownership and agricultural production. So this is a pre-industrial agricultural society. And the thought is that you cannot really be free, and you can't, in fact, have the kind of basic education that allows you to participate fully politically if your economic life isn't free, if you don't have control of the conditions of your own work. And especially for an agricultural society, what that meant was that you needed to have access to land, to property, so that you could be economically self-sufficient, or have a bench of your own so that you can direct the terms of your own work life. And that this notion of economic independence, which becomes an idea of free labor, is really central to ideas of independence and of membership in the US. That becomes closely associated with the second key element of American settlerism. And this is the thought that, well, if land is really important to be free, then that means that you need to be able to have access to land. And so it produces a continual pressure in early American society in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century for territorial expansion and native expropriation. It means that by the time we get to the 19th century, and you can see this in cases like Johnson versus McIntosh, there's an established idea that American borders after independence are not permanent borders. In other words, it's not the case that the US has, neighbors that are Native American states with actual sovereignty that has to be respected, much like England might have to respect French sovereignty. Instead, US borders are temporary, and all borders are provisional based on internal political needs. And indeed, if, let's say, England were to invade indigenous land, that effectively would be invading land that the US already claims as its sovereign right, that it allows indigenous peoples to occupy in the moment. And this is why, for me, the brand of settler politics that really takes hold in the US is best understood as a mode of settler empire, because it links freedom constitutively to an account of imperial expansion and conquest. Now, that leads to a third key point, which is precisely because the society is initially understood as pre-industrial and agricultural, there's a sense that for some people to engage in free forms of work other people are going to have to engage in hard or coerced forms of labor that are necessary for the society to reproduce itself and thrive. And the way that early colonists ended up solving this problem was by having excluded outsiders engage in the hardest forms of coerced labor, and in particular, enslaved African subjects. And so that slavery, chattel slavery, becomes a way of navigating the problem that not all labor can necessarily be free under these ideas of 17th and 18th century Republican political thought. And then over time, precisely because certain communities find themselves consigned to modes of work that are coerced or dependent, that then gets justified in racial terms, so that there becomes a racial justification precisely for the consignment to various forms of coerced work. And then fourth, in order for this project to succeed, pretty quickly, even in the 17th century, there's the sense that you're going to need more people than just the initial English colonists. And so what the colonies develop and then the independent United States ends up really institutionalizing in the 19th century is remarkably open immigration and migration policies for European migrants. So if you're European, then the border is really more a port of entry than anything like a closed barrier. And that throughout the 19th century, for example, the majority of states and territories provided for non-citizen voting if you're of European descent or access to Western land grants. And this creates a kind of remarkable dichotomy where you might be somebody of European descent, but not actually a formal citizen, and yet enjoy all the benefits of membership, where there could be communities with long histories on the ground, indigenous peoples, Black persons, whether enslaved or formerly free, Mexican Americans after the Mexican-American War, that are themselves essentially consigned to forms of subjectship, not included as full members. And indeed, they might even be formal citizens. So a Black person could be a formal citizen if they're not enslaved and yet denied the forms of inclusion that are applied to people that are European that have yet to actually be formalized as citizens. And it means that the central dichotomy in the 19th century American life is really between settler and non-settler rather than citizen and non-citizen. And it also creates a kind of remarkable transformation, which is over time, the category of whiteness becomes central, both to who gets included and who's excluded. It's actually a term that denotes broader forms of inclusion because it means that if you're French or of different kinds of European backgrounds, you can be incorporated into the national project in a way that might not have been the case in Europe, where there's a big difference between being, let's say, French and being English, and that there's a monarchical politics that really emphasizes distinguishing between these categories. Well, at the same time, even though white becomes a more capacious term than just Anglo-Protestant, it also produces a really hard divide, because if you're on the other side of the divide between white and non-white, you face systematic forms of exclusion, even if you have long histories on the land, even if you're a formal citizen. Now, what all of this suggests to me about the traditional narrative of national identity organized around the Declaration of Independence, the notion of American exceptionalism, is that where scholars have habitually presented the forms of exclusion as these kind of archaic holdovers, that there are these conflicting traditions, some inclusive, some exclusionary, that go into the same well of American ideas. I would argue that many of the things that are most emancipatory about the American project, like that rich Republican tradition of freedom as self-rule, have been politically constitutively joined to politics of expropriation, empire, and subordination. And that the fact that they've been constitutively joined is something that has to be addressed and engaged with, both as a matter of historiography, but also as a matter of basic politics. All right, I'll try to be quicker with the rest of my roadmap. So how does this connect to the revolution and to notions of sovereignty and membership after independence? My argument is that the best way to think of the American Revolution is really as a settler revolt against both the British Empire, but also against the variety of different communities that found themselves as subjects of the British Empire. So starting really in 1763, following Britain's war with France, but also following Britain's takeover of Indian Bengal, the British Empire transformed pretty dramatically from just a small set of colonies that were largely run by Anglo subjects on the eastern seaboard of the United States to this far-flung global empire that included, large swaths of what's today India, indigenous communities across North America, French Catholic Canadians in Quebec. And just as a way of attempting to maintain control over the disparate empire, Britain found itself attempting to navigate the relationship between its Anglo subjects and its non-Anglo subjects. And for many of the colonists that ended up pursuing revolution, they viewed these efforts as a direct threat to their own supremacy. And so the revolution becomes both an assault on British power, overweening power, but also an assertion of settler supremacy against all of these communities, French Canadians for Anglo-Protestant settlers, indigenous peoples, even enslaved African persons. And it means that we should think of independence as an anti-imperial revolt against the British. It's an anti-imperial act, but that the US is part really of a double history of imperialism, because that anti-imperial break actually ends up facilitating a second sustained period of colonization and imperial conquest run by settlers on the ground. And it ends up promoting a very clear theory of sovereignty that we see in the Constitution, which is we think of the Constitution, sort of written in 1787, ratified, and then going into effect in 1789, as organized around principles of checks and balances and limitations on federal and state power. But that's really only one side of the story. That system of checks is really essentially for those that are included as insiders. And so that one face of sovereign power is a face of sovereign power organized around constitutional limitations and Republican freedom, but it's tied, again, directly and constitutively to a second face of sovereign power, which is discretionary and imperial, in which those that are on the outside looking in face near continuous forms of violence and control. And that, of course, then ties to a dual system of membership, where if you're an insider, you're what I call a free citizen, even before you become a formal citizen. And indeed, that speaks to the ways in which the high tide of the U.S. as a settler society is at one and the same time the high tide of the U.S. as the nation of immigrants, in which it's incorporating all of these different communities, European communities, into a single amalgamated project under this idea of free citizenship. But that's juxtaposed against a stratified system of imperial subjectship, in which a variety of communities, indigenous peoples, enslaved Black persons, Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, face distinct and overlapping forms of authority organized around this basic settler project. So how is it that this ends up shifting over time such that we don't even really think of the country in these settler terms? The argument that I make is that at the end of the 19th and in the early 20th century, the frontier essentially closes. The economy becomes much more systematically organized around large-scale industrial capitalism. And the benefits of settler society for insiders, especially for poor and working class white male settlers, really begins to collapse. And this produces intense forms of internal class politics, the rise of various social movements like the labor movement, populism, and an effort, a real sustained effort within these movements to think in much more universal and expansive terms about how to transform the nature of American economy and how to include communities that have traditionally been viewed as outsiders. But instead, what ends up happening in the early part of the 20th century is that a range of legal, political, and business elites see the turn to the global stage as a way of solving these problems. And this is for two different reasons. One, there's a sense that conquest, just as it did in the 18th and 19th century, can provide a sense of shared project and meaning to white settlers. But also, there's the sense that global economic expansion by accessing new markets can address some of the internal economic issues by expanding the pie, producing new forms of prosperity that can de-emphasize problems that had become obvious within settler society. And that's really what we see over the course of the first half of the 20th century, which is the US's rise to global superpower status through first the Spanish-American-Cuban War and the takeover of places like Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines, but then through World War I, World War II and the fight with Nazi Germany, and then the Cold War. But critically, this all occurs at a very specific moment in global history, which is the rise and increasing assertiveness of non-white peoples globally that are contesting European colonial power. And indeed, the first half of the 20th century, culminating with World War II and the breakdown of the old imperial order after World War II, is a time in which you see the rise of independence and nationalist anti-colonial movements. And in this context, for the US to be able to assert itself as a global power requires really transforming how it presents American authority, and in particular, reclaiming an anti-slavery tradition from the mid-19th century, an abolitionist tradition that says that the US is free and equal from the founding, that the Declaration of Independence speaks to a politics opposed to slavery, and that the US is engaged in a kind of redemptive enterprise. And it also generates a set of claims about the nature of American power, that the US is unlike other European empires because its project is not built around extraction. Its project instead is built around the spread of democracy and constitutionalism. Its interests are the world's interests. These ideas become deeply embedded in national identity. They become the language for domestic reform movements, so that you have marginal communities that take up this sort of national narrative as a way of saying, well, if this is truly what the country stands for, we need to institute meaningful changes at home. And it also becomes the way that elites across different racial backgrounds come to talk to each other and to understand their own sense of national identity, political purpose, and project. And there's a way in which this is deeply heartfelt. It is not cynical. It articulates the meaning of, the victory over Nazi Germany, the successes of the civil rights movement, and on and on and on. But it comes with a profound caveat because it emphasizes the idea of the US as incompletely liberal, as ultimately having no foundational structural problems that need to be dislodged, just greater formal equality and the inclusion of outsiders into the promise of the national project. And here I'll end with a couple reflections for the present. So what does that mean for today? I think it highlights that the fact that the country, unlike, frankly, many other colonial societies across Asia, Africa, Latin America, has never had a genuine accounting with its settler colonial past, persists in developing these kinds of ongoing crises and dislocations that we see in the present. There's never been a genuine accounting when it comes to questions of basic resource redistribution to those that have historically been marginalized, issues of land return, reforms to the nature of policing and the security apparatus, which across various colonial settings is a historic way of containing populations that are viewed as unruly or threatening. And you can go on with the types of policies that we've seen elsewhere. And that all of this then creates an environment in the present, especially after the end of the Cold War, at a time in which the types of contingent dynamics that generated agreement around a story about American civic nationalism and exceptionalism are breaking down, so that we're in a sense past that Cold War period and we're thrown back into a history that feels a lot more like the late 19th, early 20th century. So we're seeing a time today where a variety of divergent ideological positions across the political spectrum are competing, and in which ideas about the basic and foundational limitations of our classic national narratives have become much more present. And it also means something else that I think is worth grappling with, which is the classic story of national identity brought with it a kind of narrative of American innocence. And that narrative of American innocence not only has justified forms of coercive power abroad, but it's also created the space at home for the rise of a virulent politics of ethno-nationalism that says, well, precisely because the US is free and equal from the founding, the people that created the country, Anglo-Europeans, have a kind of special destiny that other people have to assimilate into this project. Talking about questions of structural inequality is denying the inherent equality of the country. It's violating principles of colorblindness. And so it produces this almost strange development where the most powerful forms of kind of exclusionary rhetoric, and we can see this, for instance, in the debates around CRT, use the language of the mid-20th century, practically civil rights movement, but use the language of liberal equality and universalism as their basis. And so that civic and ethnic nationalisms become joined in ways that are oftentimes hard to disentangle because there's never really been a sustained engagement with the fact that the country's roots are still foundationally tied to a settler project that has yet to be disrupted. And so it means that for the present, genuine politics of racial economic transformation will require sort of thinking seriously about the conditions under which that colonial accounting can be made real and the extent to which one can build something like a multiracial majority committed to those kinds of changes. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor Rana. That was remarkable. It's an enormous amount of information in a short amount of time and thought-provoking, similar to your book. I'm going to put a plug one more time. This is worth the read. I don't even want to ask how long it took you to write that book because it's an enormous amount of research, I can tell just by reading it. So one is going to be focused on the international and one will be focused on the domestic. As you know, my area of comparative legal research is primarily focused with the Middle East. And I'm interested to hear your perspective and analysis is of the Arab Spring, right? The so-called Arab Spring. It seems like, it was more than a decade ago, but I think it goes without saying that we had, on the one hand, this pro-democracy, pro-freedom narrative that former President Bush was perpetuating, at the same time that he was occupying Iraq and Afghanistan. And that was supposed to then support these revolutions. But in Egypt, which is where I study more deeply, ended up supporting what was ultimately a military coup and that has led to the current situation there. So, kind of based on your research and your analysis, what are we to make of U.S. foreign policy, particularly during the Arab Spring or beyond, if you'd like to expound on that?
Yeah, I think this is a really powerful and significant question for thinking about American policy today. So the big picture argument that I make is that, starting in the early 20th century, and we see this really post World War II as well, that the basic argument is that what the U.S. does abroad is it promotes constitutional democracy, self-government. But that also, and I think as a legacy of the politics around race and membership from the 19th and earlier centuries, that also was tied to this thought, which is, well, the US, though, has this kind of exceptional history, and it's really the first among nations when it comes to knowing how best to institutionalize freedom and democracy. It has a constitutional project. It has a sense of what the right market structure should be, and that other societies are frankly, less quote unquote developed, or they're not quite as mature. And so that there needs to be some period of tutelage. This was the explicit argument in explicitly racial terms that somebody like Woodrow Wilson made in the early part of the 20th century, but it became mapped onto other discourses by the time we get to the mid 20th century, discourses about modernization and that the path to modernization, how the US was a kind of spearheading that path. And what it's done routinely is it's justified the US in intervening to reconstruct state and domestic relations in ways that it views as consistent with global peace. Now, the problem is that these reconstructions have also gone hand in hand with what elites have viewed as in the US's security interest. And what counts as what communities on the ground might view as their own self-determination and what the US believes to be its own security interests are not necessarily consistent. And indeed, they're routinely inconsistent in ways that mean that oftentimes what the US does when it comes and intervenes is it disrupts or it breaks apart what might be emerging forms of self-determination because it views it as threatening, not consistent with its own strategic objectives, in ways that end up generating forms of political authority that are either authoritarian or that don't have domestic credibility and that then require yet further exercises of violence. And I think that's a way of thinking about what's happened, for example, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But it also carries with it this other dimension, which is that there's always this persistent sense that if movement politics emerge on the ground and those movement politics are not consistent with security objectives, then the US has this international police power, this right to intervene in ways that redirect. And oftentimes the redirection moves in authoritarian terms, but that can be justified based on the idea that, well, in the long run, this redirection is going to generate something that is quote unquote moderate or quote unquote liberal. And one of the things that I think you can just see about the story of the Arab Spring is that there's obviously lots of internal dynamics. The US is not the single dominant player in how various political events ended up turning out. But if you just looked at that period from 2011, let's say to 2014, 2015, and you looked at, well, what were the settings in which the protests ended up generating something like incipient forms of democratic and self-determining politics, and what were the settings in which they did not? A clear marker of difference was the extent to which the country in which protests emerged was an American ally or not an American ally. And so you had in places like Egypt, the US being very uncomfortable, essentially, with the transformations of domestic Egyptian politics in ways that would shift from American priorities. And so a willingness to ultimately back the emergence of new forms of dictatorship. And you can tell a similar story about, the US's support for Saudi Arabia and its various crackdowns in the region. You can tell a similar story in a way about what happened in a place like Libya, where the US participated in an intensive bombing campaign. And so to me, one of the great dilemmas and really tragedies of American foreign policy in the 20th century is this sustained effort to marry an argument about self-determination that the US is committed to promoting everywhere with claims about its own internal security interests. And the ways in which what that's done repeatedly over and over again across a variety of different settings is kind of generate forms of instability that then justify the need for American international power to come in to resolve the instability in ways that create perpetual cycles.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. I'm yet to be convinced that the United States truly cares about self-determination or democracy of other countries, particularly when they're not in Europe. But I'd love to be proven incorrect. One of the areas or identities that we're very proud of at Rutgers Law School, particularly in Newark, also known as the People's Electric Law School, is that we train our students to engage our curriculum and our experiential programs to try to be some of those change agents that you've talked about, or these, or to lead these change movements that you've discussed, Professor Rana. So thank you very much for your talk today.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.